I'm looking for an extraordinary trait. The reason why is the chance, if you think about what's the likelihood that someone starts a company and reinvents the world or an industry in the proverbial garage with like their college roommate.
Sure.
Rounds to basically zero. So unless you have a trait that is so extraordinary that the probabilities shift off rounding to zero, you should not invest. So that's why I need a top 1%, top 10 basis points, something spike, or I'm not going to invest. Then you want to ask a question. The second question is, does what the person spikes on relate to the skills that are required to build this particular company? Some of these traits are transferable, like if you can recruit better than anybody else on the planet, like if you can assess people, close people, that will apply to any company, whether you're building SpaceX or Facebook. Some skills don't translate. Like for example, if you're the savviest technologist in the history of the world, there are some companies where you could, like let's say we're doing a database company, a new novel architecture for database, sure, that's a perfect company to fund for that kind of founder. They want to do a photo sharing app, I'm not sure they can really leverage that trait. So you do ask that, but that's usually the second question, not the first.
And when is domain expertise a good thing versus a bad thing?
So in my view, it's never a good thing. I don't fund people with domain expertise. I do like them to be able to answer the Balaji and the Chris Dixon blog post that summarizes it, intellectual maze question, which is Balaji, when he's teaching startup engineering at Stanford, had this great paragraph that explained how the most amazing founders can walk you through the roadmap from where they are to super success and know how to avoid the pitfalls, trapdoors, and navigate. And when you hear the clarity of a roadmap, it's extremely rare. It happens once a year or so. That's a reason to invest, maybe independent of the traits. But the traits that are exceptional plus the intellectual roadmap is like a home run. It's like instant investment. Here's your money. Do not pass go. You don't have to meet my colleagues. Here's your money. Please, please, please do not take any more meetings. That rarely happens. That can be based upon some experience. So for example, one of the founders we work with in Miami, before he left Uber to start his company, had been a warehouse supervisor before he went to Uber. And he started a labor marketplace that connects workers to light industrial warehouses. So the fact that he'd started his career out of college as a warehouse supervisor was insightful, but it's the other traits about this founder that make him extraordinary and a top 1% founder on the planet.
And is there, if not in the founders, at some of these companies, you need domain expertise brought in so that you don't fall in.
So you can borrow it. This is the trick. You can always call up people with domain expertise and ask them questions. They're actually pretty happy to talk to you usually. And you just say, why can't this work? So the question I always ask when I do diligence, like when, let's say I occasionally invest in some pretty deeply technical things like autonomous driving or genomic sequencing. So when I call up experts, what I'll ask them is, tell me why this can't work. I don't want to know whether it can work. I want to know metaphysically, point to something that will make this impossible to solve. And if they can't articulate a specific blocker, then I'm pretty comfortable backing a world-class founder to try to solve it.
I've heard you say that the most successful founders are trending older than they were in the past.
We've observed at Founders Fund that there's about a 5-year shift on average of the most successful founders in the, let's say, median age over the last 5 years. We have no agreement internally on what the root cause of that shift is.
Do you have a theory?
I actually don't have a great theory. I can walk you through some proposed hypotheses, but I think most of them are confounded by the actual data. So for example, some people think it's cultural, there's different influences, et cetera, et cetera. Some people think it's like this entitlement and wokeism and all this other stuff. I don't think that really drives. Some people think that the businesses are more enterprise, which requires more experience than, let's say, maybe a consumer. I don't think that's actually true. I think most of the logical hypotheses are defied by the actual data. So I'm not at all convinced of a theory that works. And so it's more descriptive than prescriptive for me right now.
Now, you've stepped into more of a firm management, as we touched on earlier, and developing young investors, setting firm strategy, all of that. I think that was, at least Delian said, with KB, you were more IC-oriented, sort of eat what you kill. And now it seems like you've taken on more of a firm initiative setting. Is that?
No, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't agree with that. I think that one of the keys in venture is grooming more and more talent because it's a 10, 20-year journey. And you need to replace yourself. I don't think venture capitalists age very well. Like there's a point at which you improve and there's a point at which you start decaying. We can talk about why and where. But so I think you always need to be consciously aware of how do you get more talent into your firm and how do they learn by osmosis to be world-class investors. So at KV, I hired several people, Delian included. I recruited Evan Moore to KV like 3 times to try to add to the talent at KV. So I don't think that's accurate. Maybe just because of my profile, I may get more inquiries from other up-and-coming investors that want to join us, and they may route to me more frequently. So I may interview them or assess them more, but I don't think it's a conscious strategy.
How do you think about setting founders fund strategy for the next whatever it is and influencing where you're headed as a firm?
Well, the way we generally do it is the GPs debate a fair amount. We meet, let's say every quarter, we do an offsite. But like the GPs will debate, what do we want to do differently or better, or what do we want to amplify or not? So that's basically how we work.
And decisioning, how do you actually think through making an investment decision as a group?
The historical way we've worked at Founders Fund, which is pretty different than most VCs, including at KV, we have voting thresholds. So for different size checks, you require a different level of support from different colleagues. So let's say you wanted $10 million. I translate to our voting rules and know how many people need to approve that, and we'll introduce the founder to the requisite number of people, or the people I think are differentially likely to approve. At the KV, we would do more like a traditional partner meeting on a Monday. Team would come in and present, and then we'd have a dialogue debate after and decide whether to approve an investment, what terms.
What characteristics have you found in the good young VCs that you've been around or you've worked with?
Well, there's not that many of them, by the way. I think one of the fictions of the 2019 to 21 era was venture's easy. And so people thought that entering venture early in your career was attractive, lucrative, and potentially easy from a lifestyle perspective. And it's none of those things. Venture is a really hard business. It's to be successful in terms of driving true returns and distributions to the LPs and to yourself and your colleagues is pretty rare. It's about the equivalent of being an NBA All-Star, and to be a consistent NBA All-Star is pretty rare. And so I think now there's very few people that are young investors, qual investors, that are actually truly driving distributions for their LPs or for themselves. So I don't know what the formula is. I wish I did. It is something we actually discussed, like what's the formula for a future great VC? But it's a little bit like trying to predict who the next Steph Curry is. Steph Curry didn't look like the Patrick Ewings and Elijah Wands and Moses Malones, nor did Charles Barkley actually. And so you're trying to figure out where the sport's going and try to project what you want to hire, recruit, train for.
And so when you bring in someone like Sam Blond joined recently, which he was a CRO of Brex and Zenefits before that, right? And so when you're hiring an operator that hasn't done investor before, like, are you doing the same assessment of where they spike? Is it more of a holistic liberal assessment?
There was a couple dimensions to hiring Sam. One was he had a pretty significant angel track record. So that is a good proxy. It's not a perfect proxy for venture, but it's relevant. B, as a byproduct of that, he also had referenceable CEOs who are in our portfolio that we respect deeply. Let's say Parker at Rippling, for example, that worked with him very closely. So that's a good proxy. Like, would you differentially take money from this person? That's the answer you want to hear from founders is, yes, I would prefer to work with this person versus the rest of the world. So like having a repertoire of people you've served very closely with that are very close to us that we deeply respect is a good proxy. So angel investing plus CEO respect are pretty important predictors.